Okay guys, welcome back to the channel. It's time. Time for what, you say? Well, time to wrap up my series on the GR Research NXtreme. I've been covering this for over a year now, going through every single stage in the process. And I've done everything from even show room measurements and my impressions and things I've tweaked to help mate the speaker to the room. But there were a few other things I promised, so I'll wrap it all up in this video, try to keep it in the 20-minute range. So bear with me here, but these are the things that I wanted to cover. Number one, got a lot of questions about associated gear and especially why I chose to use REL 25 sub and SVS seal box subs versus the open baffle subs. So I'll cover that. The other things are maybe some of the electronics that I use are a little bit different than Deity's, why I did that. Also, I'm fortunate to hear quite a bit of cost no object systems, either going to shows, dealerships, audiophiles, houses. I've heard it all over 30 plus years. So how does this speaker benchmark against the really cost no object speakers? And is there anything that I tweaked other than, with direct and EQ to made it to the room? Is there anything I tweaked on the speaker, changed, or found disappointing? I don't want to be a total fanboy. I want to be totally honest. And so I'll address those things in this video as well. And also maybe where I see this speaker potentially going, if there's ever going to be another level of it. I even kind of joked in a previous video, what would be the NXXX Extremes, the Ron Jeremy version. So I'm going to put on my fantasy hat and just envision where that would go. So let's just start though with the specifics on the speaker. Let's get this out of the way. What are anything that I found disappointing or things that I would have changed per se, or had to tweak a little bit? And really there isn't much. And number one, anything that I do say is irrespective of the value. I'm taking value out of the equation at this point. This is a tremendous value speaker, and as I've said in every video, it will compete with cost no object speakers on its own merit as is, just fine. Just has all the bones there to provide you neutral, coherent, dynamic, detailed, full range. Those are the priorities I look for in a speaker. And that's why you probably haven't heard me use certain audiophile jargon like bright or warm or polite. Some of those more nebulous terms are fine, and sometimes they're more applicable to really what the tweeter's doing and how it's mating with your room. But because I'm getting this, I can make the speaker sound however I want. If I don't have the right room treatments and don't cover the back wall reflections or side wall reflection, it could be bright. It could be warm. I could do things with EQ or change some of the room placement issues. So that's why you're not hearing the typical jargon. And I'm kind of against using that jargon unless you get the total picture of what's causing potentially it to be bright, warm, all these other more nebulous jargon terms. The number one things I look for in a speaker to be cost no object performance is full range, dynamic, coherent, detailed, neutral. That's what this provides, the platform to here be a window in the recording of what was recorded. So getting that out the way though, what were some things that I found that probably, if I benchmark this against the very best speakers out there, irrespective of value, what were some things I could nitpick? Well, really the only thing that might fall in the disappointing level would be that one driver that was defective. And it's not really the fact that I had a rare defective driver. It's the fact that even before I even had the defective driver and I was holding that driver in my hand, it just didn't impress me as being that high end. And I think he uses that with all of his lower budget model speakers too. And there's a smart reason for it. I'm not knocking him for doing that, because you need to buy 16 of those. Okay. So I wouldn't want to pay for, I'll show you, I'll put up a video maybe of a B&W driver, which is super heavy in your hand, the construction, everything about it, you can tell may feel and look past the look test is more high end than this driver, but I wouldn't want to pay for 16 of them, because the cost to performance ratio probably isn't there when you're talking about a woofer and bass frequencies. So I understand why he did it, but still if I'm being totally honest, that speaker driver did not impress me. And probably what happened, either it was defective because I wasn't that impressed, as I mentioned, with the manufacturer telling Danny a lot of things that just never transpired in terms of delivery. But probably what happened is either the speaker that I had was defective from the start, or they're put in a box where the drivers are facing each other and a spacer is connecting them with, keeping them separate via the screw holes. But that speaker driver just is not substantial, didn't feel like that firm, that I think in a box with shipping damage and torquing, depending on how it dropped, I think that things can get warped or bent in that driver, especially when you connect two together with those spacers. And probably what happened is something like that happened, assuming it left the facility working properly, but it got warped. And then when the pistonic motion of the driver, once it warped, that's what was making it scratch. So just my theory, but either way, it just indicates to me a little bit of disappointment with that particular driver. And the other thing I didn't even mention is that these all have plastic rings, and some of them even came with divots. Maybe I'll shoot an image and pop it up of a specific one. They're not all even perfect, but I was just so happy to get the drivers. I didn't really care about minor cosmetic blemishes on the edges. But that's just something, if you're going to benchmark against people with cost no object budgets, it's not always about performance at the listening chair. It's a lot of other things that go into it. I think looks wise, when I put on the LEDs and my paint job, I'm happy with that. So looks in terms of paint job and all that's going to be subjective, but little qualitative aspects like the quality of that driver benchmarked against the cost no object speaker drivers, though there will be a noticeable difference just in your hands and sight and plastic. The other thing, that getting into more things that I would tweak or do differently with this speaker, it comes back to, if you did get a driver with a metal ring, I would even do a gasket mounted to the baffle that's got already threaded holes, because you're drilling this straight into MDF, and MDF is soft. So if you constantly have to replace drivers, hopefully I don't, it won't be an issue, but you're going to wear out that hole that you're drilling straight into MDF, because that's kind of soft. And so I wouldn't want that for a long-term solution. So a gasket that would be with threaded hole and mounted to the baffle, kind of inset, would be something that would take it to the next level of competing with cost no object on these other aspects. And then also, one thing I did notice with the speaker now, compared to other speakers I've seen, owned, it's a lot less, but I was able to get cabinet resonances to appear. Again, 3/4 inch MDF and no res is great. Very good. And even Danny said I was worried about resonances. Two things I was worried about when I bought the speaker, before I bought the speaker, was, are all these drivers going to be coherent? And I visited Danny, and that's when I knew he knew what he was doing, because it was really coherent and well done. Great crossover. But the other thing I was worried about was resonances, because it's a very milled out MDF, not very firm. But he said, he even LOL, he's like, this thing's got tons of braces, it should be no problem. And for the most part, he's right. MDF, 3/4 inch MDF and the no res do a great job for the most part. But I was able to get some resonances in this little window area, because there's no braces in a wider window right in the middle. And then also you have a cutout on this one side here. So the firmness is not as strong here. And then you have these drivers, with a little bit more excursion than the woofers. And then you have your tweeter with hitting frequencies that sometimes combine and create a resonance. So I feel the speaker vibrating a lot more right here than other parts. And I could only get it to transpire anything audibly loud with certain frequencies, even get the tweeter to maybe put out a sound where it really shouldn't be putting out a sound. But Danny also thought it could be due to the excursion of these drivers' air. Sometimes it may even provide air that hits the driver below at the tweeter here. So I put one of the other modifications I did, other than adding no res to control the resonances in this area, more than what Danny normally provides, at least on his demo model. But I did no res a lot around here, and then I put blue tack, which is kind of a gummy type surface substance, and just airtight the tweeter all around. But it gets back to the gasket thing I was talking about. There is a thing that Audio does where they do these pour-on gaskets. So pour-on is kind of a substance, vibration control substance like sorbitane or whatever, but they're doing it to kind of decouple the driver from the baffle, making a gasket with that pour-on. So I think that might be something next level that can help decouple these drivers from what is a great cabinet, but not, let's not get it twisted. This is not Rockport, Magico, YG, you know, it just can't be, especially at this budget range. And you could argue that the amount of money they put into those other companies put into the cabinet doesn't have a good price to reward ratio, but we're taking value out of the equation today. That's one area where, you know, you could see some improvement in the future with different elevations and design. I even considered doing this in Panzerholz originally. Again, cost profile did not warrant me going that route, but if I want to put on that fantasy hat of where I would go with this speaker in the future while we're talking about this, I think that this could be really, if you have a cost no object budget, doing this in Panzerholz, which is almost bulletproof material, so it'd have to be all CNC'd out. Even the holes would have to be CNC'd out and kind of bolted together, because you can't screw, glue, nail through Panzerholz once it's done. But I was thinking maybe this would be cool to be a modular speaker where there's 4 woofers at the bottom, then you've got your 3 here and the 4 at the top. You could do 3 modules. It'd be a lot easier to put together than constantly having to do 7 feet panels that often kind of want to bend and warp because you're cutting out so much, at least on one side. That could be really cool. And then if in small modules, you could probably get Panzerholz milled and CNC to these specifications and make it actually even easier to put together. And then you'd have a cabinet level comparable, or at least in the competitive range with Rockport, YG and all that, just from a material standpoint with the pour-on gaskets and all that. So just, that's talking about the fantasy side of things of where I would go with this if I ever built it again. Or let's talk about my associated equipment, because that's one thing that I get a lot of questions on. So I'm not a big believer in chip amps or low power tube amps, but I understand preferences. I understand people do it, and I understand this speaker works well with it, worked fine at Danny's with it. Just not something I'm interested in doing. I just don't like them. I don't like chip amps. I don't like low power tube amps. I like the headroom. I like a neutral, liquid, dynamic, totally powerful, in reserves by as much as possible amplifier that doesn't add any distortion or coloration or anything like that. So that's why I still use my modified McCormick's, which are overkill at 400 watts into 8 ohms per channel, but dynamics out of the wazoo, no, just effortless presentation, no distortion added for coloration purposes. I totally understand if you like that stuff, and on a budget, some of those chip amps are actually quite good. My concern with the chip amps, again, is more so reliability. So, you know, if you modify them, get the better capacitors in there, I just don't like the qualitative aspect of reliability of those chip amps and what they could possibly do, damage your speakers or, you know, just fail. So, you know, I'm more of the traditional AB design amplifiers, big transformers, lots of headroom, power, you know, just a tried and true design, but utmost parts. And so that's why I use the McCormick's on these, and it matches perfectly. With regard to other things, you'll see here a mini DSP SHD. I'll go into a totally different video on that, because setup and all that, powerful piece, but it gives you the ability to use direct and Rune. As you can see with my server I still use, very few people can get direct and Rune. This is one option. Emotiva surround sound processor, which I also have. But I'll go into that in a separate video because that'll take a while. But a lot of power with these things, and a lot of tips that I couldn't share I want to give a shout out to all my subscribers. I almost want to keep it at the level it is now, because one thing I've been super impressed with is I've got lots of subscribers and viewers that really know what they're talking about, really well versed in being an audiophile. Or if you're new, you'll all have the right attitude. You're like learning, and you're not poo-pooing stuff or getting frustrated. I've been very impressed with the comments, almost 100%, very few trolls or anything. So shout out to you guys. I'm glad that I'm attracting, these type of audiophiles and not the trolls and the problem people. But yeah, I want to give you guys, part of my channel is helping out people that were in my same shoes many years ago, and kind of helping you avoid some of the problems I had to go through. So especially with EQ and direct, there's a minefield, and I understand where people get the wrong impression and bad vibes from it. So I want to walk you through a lot of other things that I couldn't share in that first video to help you out. Now, other equipment. Subwoofer. Why did I do the Rel 25 sub versus Danny subs? Because I actually bought this after I even bought the NXtremes. And so money wise, it would have been better to do the open baffle, Danny's open baffle subs. And I heard them at his place, and they sound great. And he did an admirable job of mating them to the main speakers without active bass management. Do I still prefer bass management and sealed box sub? Yes. And why? A couple things. At sub frequencies, I still prefer a great sub that's sealed box. And the reason being is there's not a whole lot of pitch definition and texture and detail at those sub frequencies. When it's doing these other frequencies, the open baffle bass and these smaller drivers in an open baffle platform, perfectly fine. And actually, that's the strength of this speaker. The bass performance is amazing within, how far it goes down. And I'd put what I've getting in this room now, I would benchmark against any speaker anywhere in bass performance, and by a sizable margin, I would even say better than anything I've ever heard. But being able to meticulously mate it, bass management, Rel sub, great main channel speakers, that's all part of the equation that and the great room that's been, treated is part of the equation that you rarely ever see, or hear. So at the bass frequencies, I find that the seal box sub gives you that tightness, speed, impact. It also doesn't call attention to itself as much as ported subwoofers that have the port that sometimes you can hear the port chuffing. And then with open baffle, I would say that those open baffle subs, I would recommend, for 99.9% of people, it's a slam dunk, especially at the cost. So I'm not saying anything bad about open baffle subs. I'm just saying the nuances that made me slightly prefer this is a couple things. Number one, open baffle bass at the sub frequencies is less, in my opinion, advantageous than at these other frequencies here. Because when you get down to sub frequencies, you need to have a lot of drivers, and usually big drivers. So you see Danny sub is huge, 3 big drivers. And for the most part, it's not a problem. But when you're playing really low and at high volumes, those subs tend to call attention to itself, because now the cabinet is your room, and that those drivers are basically just moving air around in your room. And so with that many more drivers, big drivers, to create the same SPLs and frequencies of a Rel 25, it calls attention to itself just from a mechanical standpoint, if that makes sense. Kind of like if you're blind and somebody were to walk into a room and open the door, move the door a little bit, a blind person can even sense that movement of air in the room. And so it's a primitive analogy, but I'm just trying to say what, from a mechanical standpoint, big drivers and open air in a room where the room is the cabinet, I sense it more. And my little nitpicky thing is, and I only found it once when I was at Danny's, where I kind of could call attention to the sub, and I was like, oh yeah, I hear it now. So it's not, with most music, you're fine. Like I said, 99.9%, I'm just neurotic in this one little area. I don't like to hear the sub, period. And there is another thing, the great thing about Danny sub is it has a lot of tweaking of settings, but as he's had to explain to some people that say, oh, my sub or my bass isn't as tight as this other speaker. And then he's explained to him, well, you've got the setting on low extension, but not as tight. You can choose the setting of tight, but not as much extension. And so that's great that he gives you that option on that sub. But with the Rel 25, quite honestly, you don't have a trade-off. You get the speed, you get the extension at 20 hertz. There is no choice that you have to make. And the only other thing I'll say about subs in general, not so much Danny, but I see dogmatic. If a sub has servo, it's better. Okay, now, servo subs by Rhythmic have a tried and true. They were good. My friend has the Salk version, and that's a really good sub too. And Danny's is good too. But don't get dogmatic about if a sub has servo, it's better. I had a servo Velodyne sub, and it was total crap. You can't make a driver do what it's incapable of doing. So it's kind of like, servo is kind of like EQ, if you think about it. It's got the quasi mic, a sensor, and then it tries to correct things to be accurate to what it was fed. Same thing you kind of do with EQ, or at least can do. But just like EQ, you can't make it do too much. If you're sending it a signal and it didn't get it right the first time, and you send a correction, who's to say that it's going to get that correction right? It didn't get the first one right. How's it going to get the second one right? And then you could be building correction after correction after correction. You still need to build the sub correctly. You can't just put a servo on a 6-inch driver and get 20 hertz out of it. So the concept of servo alone is kind of a pet peeve of mine. That doesn't make it better, okay? On its own. Within a standpoint of a great build sub, and it's just doing minor things, kind of like you would do for EQ, yeah, totally get it. And like I said, Rhythmic's got a proven track record, but others don't. And on that note, one of the biggest promoters of servo bass was Paul McGowan, PS Audio. And I would hear his videos. His videos are helpful. I don't have anything against the guy. I'm sure many people find some of his videos helpful. But the thing is, he would talk about servo bass, Arnie Nudell. Rest in peace, great guy. Very talented. But servo bass, they've actually gave up on it. I think from what I heard last, they couldn't get their speaker in over 3 years to come out in something they liked. And I heard 2 versions of it at Rocky Mountain. The first prototype, which was almost like garage, came right out of the garage. It was almost like taped together. And that was kind of disappointing, if I'm being nice. The next year, 2019, it sounded a little better. But I think they've given up totally on servo bass, and now they're coming out with a speaker that's more traditional design. So even the most adamant servo proponent, like a Paul McGowan, is putting out a speaker without servo bass, at least the last I heard. So again, I just wanted to make sure people are clear and don't get dogmatic and look kind of foolish later, like we've seen on that subject. But again, subwoofer wise, for the value, I would go with Danny's sub, especially if you're crossing over speakers much higher. I would actually probably recommend that sub for Maggie's, open baffle. That's a great option. So nothing against it. I'm just explaining the nuances of why I chose this one, because a lot of people have asked. All right, did I cover everything? Oh, cost no object. What would I benchmark these speakers in terms of comparison purposes? I guess the one that most reminds me of the performance I'm getting here was a room I did a while back at somebody's house that had YG 2.3s, really well treated room with total acoustic curtains covering the wall, so there was no really reflection issues. It was a tight room like this too, so it gave me that same near field that I like. Dynamic, tall. It's not an open baffle, but the YGs have sealed bass and are full range, probably more full range even than these on their own. Now, when I get the Rel 25 and these, I like the bass better here than I was hearing there. Tweeter-wise, I can see people liking maybe the YG better. Again, tweeter-wise, that's where people are going to get their, nuances and maybe use that jargon that you hear to their preferences. you know, this coherency, I value coherency more than almost anything, but it gives you plenty of detail. I'm not sacrifice anything with this tweeter. Would it be cool to see if Danny could get a plasma tweeter or beryllium, diamond, you know, these AMT tweeters that I was told now have tremendously low distortion? Would it be cool to see if he could get one of those to meld well and into this? That would be cool. I'd like to hear it, but at this point, I would not recommend any changes. I like it just the way it is. Um, you know, in the jargon world, I would call it neutral, you know, to a more dry, neutral presentation, not adding anything, not taking anything away. You know, you're going to get enough detail, but you're not maybe get the pizzazz or some of the silkiness of the other tweeters that I've heard in the, you know, in the cost no object. So, but I would put the performance of this speaker really close. And in this room, I actually prefer this one better to the YG 2.3s. But if I had YG 2.3s in here and did all the rigmarole that I did with these, you know, could I like those better? Who knows? But so close, and that's a testament to really the brilliance of this speaker design, the open baffle bass, the choice of drivers that, while not cost no object, give you that level of performance and value, getting back to the value equation, that you really can't beat. So I'm super happy with these. Hopefully you enjoyed my series of putting them together, and I've given you enough feedback to kind of know what you could expect on your side if you do it. You got to, though, put the effort in, both in the build and setting up in your room so that it mates properly. But this is a platform for which you can get end game cost no object performance. So sign up, subscribe, because you're going to want to hear my video on this mini DSP SHD. And also, I'm going to Rocky Mountain with the 3MA guys. We have 2 rooms there. So stay tuned for that soon. So subscribe, sign up for notifications, and I'll see you soon.